Yeah, thanks for joining us this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Doug McKenzie-Mohr. Doug has been using behavioral insights to foster sustainable behavior for 20 some odd years. He's worked with over 60,000 policymakers. Is that an accurate number? So that's super impressive. The book that Kate just showed everyone, I actually have all my social impact MBA students. That's our summer reading and book club book. And so that's what we read before coming in to do your MBA at Questrom if you're a social impact student. And so I really enjoy that book. His website, his CBSM website is absolutely fantastic. And so that's a community-based social marketing website. It's got amazing resources, more than 2,000 articles that you can find in there. What I find really useful in there is that you can actually find, and he has articles on there that show interventions that have failed. And I think that we can learn as much from those as the others. And so it's a great resource. So please, when you have time, go to cbsm.com, especially anybody who's interested in kind of using community-based social marketing and kind of the tools to influence behavior. So I'm going to leave it there. And again, thank you, Doug, for joining us. And I know this is going to be a fantastic talk, and I'm excited and looking forward to it. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Remi. And thanks to all of you for joining this session this afternoon. And I want to say also, too, that I hope wherever you happen to be joining this session from, that you're beginning to see some light on the horizon with respect to the pandemic. I want to mention before I get into my comments this afternoon that I'm joined this afternoon by Jennifer Tabanico. Jennifer and I have worked together for years. Jennifer is remarkably knowledgeable about the use of community-based social marketing. She is the president of an agency called Action Research, which is based in Oceanside, California, and they have delivered scads of community-based social marketing programs globally. Jennifer's going to be helping me out this afternoon by answering questions that you might have while I'm speaking in chat. And then at the end of my presentation, which will be roughly an hour, and then I will entertain any questions you might have, and I'll ask you at that time to raise your virtual hand, and I'll call upon you for questions you might have about my presentation. But let's dig in. I want to start off by telling you a story that'll set the stage for everything I'm going to discuss with you this afternoon. I've spent most of my career as an academic, even though I'm no longer an academic teaching. I still think of myself as an academic. I worked initially at a university in Southern Ontario called Wilfrid Laurier. And then in 1993, my wife and I, and our two very young daughters at that time, moved so I could take a tenure track position at a small liberal arts university in Atlantic Canada. For obvious reasons, when we moved our home, I did not move our composter. And one of the first things I did after I got our new house set up in Fredericton, which is the capital of New Brunswick in Atlantic Canada, is I went and purchased a new composter. I brought it back home, I put it together, I went in the house and said to my wife, where do you think we should put this composter in our backyard? And Sue and I are having this conversation in the kitchen at the back of our house, looking out on our backyard. And we had this very long, narrow backyard. And my wife says to me, why don't you put it back there? Now, the back there that Sue's pointing at is this bush that's just strategically larger than the size of a composter. So if you put the composter back behind this bush, looking out any of the windows at the back of our house, you won't see the thing. And that seemed like a good idea in the summer of 1993. So we begin to compost. And we compost through July, August, September, October, November, and then it begins to snow. And it begins to snow like nothing I've ever seen in my life before. Now, when I've told this story before to begin off workshops or presentations that I'm doing, I've had this sense that people thought I was exaggerating the amount of snowfall that we get in Atlantic Canada. So I have pictures with me this afternoon, and there's an interesting anecdote behind these pictures. I've been strategically leaving Canada for about the last 18 years in the middle of our winter. And I've been going to Hawaii and doing workshops there often. And then I go to New Zealand, and then I go to Australia. And these trips are often quite long. They're often 6 to 9 weeks of doing workshops in these different locations. Because who wouldn't go to those locations basically in the middle of Canadian winter? So the fact that I'm away has meant that my wife and my daughters are home alone, basically looking after whatever snowfall might come. So I'm in Perth, Western Australia about 4 years ago. And I get this email from my wife. There's no content in the email. I've been away for about 6 weeks at that point. You'd imagine your partner, would say, I miss you, looking forward to coming home, etc. It's blank. There's just simply a subject line that says, time to come home, exclamation mark, and then this picture is attached. This is the picture of the front of our house in Fredericton that my wife took moments before she sends this email to me. To make sure that I get the message that it's really time for me to come home. A nanosecond after this first email, I get a second email from her, and this subject line says, time to come home, comma, I really mean it, 3 exclamation marks this time. And Sue takes a picture of the stop sign at the corner of our lot. So I'm in Perth, Western Australia. It's about 42 degrees Celsius there, and I'm seeing this picture and feeling guilty. So I Google stop signs in Canada to see just how high is this? How much snow is this? 2.17 meters to the bottom of the sign by regulation. The signs themselves are 60 centimeters. This is 2.5 meters of snow roughly that my wife and my daughters have been looking after. So coming back to that summer, that first year of 1993, again, as I said to you, compost for July, August, September, October, November, and then it begins to snow. And 2 or 3 times a week, I would come back from the university I was teaching at, and I'd shovel off the driveway and shovel the walkway to the front door and the side door, and I would go behind the house to shovel this pathway out to this backyard composter that I stupidly put at the end of this long, narrow backyard. By the end of that first December, the snow was up to my waist. And I remember coming home this one day. It had been a long day at work, and I came home and I shoveled off the driveway again, shoveled the walkway to the front door and the side door, and I go behind the house and think to myself, this is December. They often get snow all the way through to the beginning of May in New Brunswick. So rather than shoveling the pathway to the backyard composter, I go into the house and say to my wife, that's it. For the remainder of this first winter, those organics are going to end up in the garbage at the curbside rather than a backyard composter. So why am I starting off this presentation by telling this? Like everyone else on this call, I'm relatively knowledgeable about sustainability issues. But for that first winter, my behavior was not consistent with my knowledge or my motivation to engage in waste reduction. And if you and I are all honest with one another, that's true of every single person in this session. There's not one of us that can say that we always take the shortest showers we possibly could. There's not one of us that could say that we reduce single-use plastics as much as we possibly could. There's not one of us that could say that we always make transportation choices that reduce carbon dioxide emissions as much as possible. And why I want to start off the session by stressing this is if the very people who wish to design and deliver these types of programs are not consistently engaging in actions that move us towards sustainability, then the much larger issue is, what could we expect of the general population? People who, for the most part, are less motivated and less knowledgeable, because those are the individuals that people are designing and developing programs for. So we're going to take an intensive look over this next hour or so at how we can make use of insights from the behavioral sciences to design and deliver more effective programs to encourage people to engage in those types of behaviors, even though they may be less knowledgeable, maybe less motivated on these issues. But I want to start first with depressing you. I want to talk with you about the types of programs that get conventionally delivered. I've, as Remi mentioned, worked with many, many different agencies around the globe who are working on delivering sustainability programs. And as an environmental psychologist, we would refer to the vast majority of programs that are out there today as being information intensive. And if I had to guess, I would guess that more than 80% of all existing programs, most of which are delivered by local councils. As most of you know, most environmental initiatives are delivered by local councils dealing with waste, water, transport, energy, etc. And these programs are all based, for the most part, on this simple premise. We're going to utilize different mediums, radio, television, the internet, newsprint, social media, to push information to people with a hope that providing them with that information is going to do one of two things. It's going to change their attitudes with respect to the behavior we're trying to encourage, and it's going to, at the same time, change their level of knowledge. And the simple presumption behind almost all environmental programs in North America and elsewhere is that people simply knew more and cared more, they would change their behavior. Now, what's intriguing about that as a suggestion is that we've been studying what is the relationship between people's environmental attitudes, environmental knowledge, and their behavior for literally decades in the field of environmental psychology. And here's what we find. There's often very little connection and frequently no connection between people's attitudes, their knowledge, and their environmental behavior. At the core of all environmental education is this simple premise: if people simply knew more and cared more, they would do more. But we know that that's not true in many circumstances. Let me show you two examples of this idea. This first example is a great example to begin off with because it goes so far beyond what most local councils, or again, delivering most environmental programs, could hope to do. This is a project delivered by Scott Geller at Virginia Tech, a colleague of mine. And Scott is testing, are people's attitudes and knowledge importantly related to their actual behavior? And what he does literally is he runs an ad in the local newspaper, and he says essentially, if you'd like to learn how to make your home more energy efficient, come to this 3-hour Saturday morning session where we will teach you those things. However, we're only taking 40 participants. So you have to be one of the first 40 people to call in or you won't get a space. So you've got an extensive amount of time to spend with these people who want to make their homes more energy efficient. They're motivated. And on top of that, we've got much more time than we normally would have, 3 hours. In most cases, local agencies only have a few minutes with people rather than hours with them. Now, Galler measures their attitudes and knowledge before the workshop begins, and he does the same thing afterwards. And again, he's measuring the expected residential energy use and people's knowledge, etc. What does he find? People are significantly more knowledgeable after the workshop than they were beforehand, and they have attitudes that are much more supportive of now making their homes much more energy efficient. But does that actually translate into changes in people's behavior? So months after this session, he actually goes to people's homes to find out what, if anything, did these 40 people do? And here's the answer to that question. One person had lowered the temperature on the hot water heater, something that was recommended at the workshop and is remarkably easy to do. 2 people put insulating blankets around their hot water heater. You can literally tell if yours needs one at home by putting your hand on it. And if it's radiating heat, it's not well insulated. Those 2 people that did this, however, did it before the workshop began. So unless you believe in bends in the space-time continuum, there's no connection between the actual workshop and people wrapping their hot water heater. Here's the only other thing, and I want to stress, here's the only other thing that people did. Following the workshop, 8 of 40 people, nearly 25%, installed high-efficiency shower heads. So that sounds a little more encouraging. Until you learn that Galler gave all 40 of them high-efficiency shower heads and only 8 of them put them in place. Now again, in my mind, this sets the outside boundary conditions of what most of us could hope to do. You've got a highly motivated audience, a substantial amount of time with them, and you see virtually nothing in terms of actual behavioral change. The second example comes much closer to what we see councils all across the United States and Canada actually do. They don't hold workshops or intensive like this. Instead, they distribute flyers and brochures and bill stuffers out to their target audiences, whether that's businesses or households, with the hope that it'll change people's behavior. Here's a community in the United States in which they spent $50,000 doing exactly that. They produced the water use handbook, they described wasteful water use, talked about the relationship between energy and water usage, and a detailed conservation methods that people could engage in. Now, what's intriguing about this handbook is half the community received it randomly, and the other half did not. So, Remi, on my screen, you're right beside Matilda. Matilda, if the 2 of you were actually living beside each other, by chance, Matilda, you might get this by chance, and Remi, you don't. And so again, they're randomly signing everyone in the community to either receive or not receive the handbook. Everyone's household is individually water metered. So they can look at water consumption before the handbook is distributed, and they can look at water consumption afterwards. What impact did the handbook actually have? And the answer to that is absolutely none. And we see this finding again and again and again in the literature. The environmental psychology literature is not at all kind with respect to the impact that information-intensive programs actually have in changing people's behavior. So an important question then is, why do these actually exist? Why do people continue to deliver programs that are simply information-intensive in their nature? And I think one of the reasons is I think they literally get seduced by conventional commercial marketing. And they imagine that if those advertisements are working well to have people buy consumer goods, that we can run information-intensive programs and get people to engage in sustainability-related initiatives. But I want to suggest to you strongly that having someone purchase something is often quite different from having them do something. So think about getting someone to buy a vehicle. If you're Ford, you want people obviously to buy your vehicle rather than someone else's. But many people working in the sustainability field don't want the person to buy the vehicle at all. They want them to carpool and telecommute and ride their bike to work, a whole set of behaviors that are far more challenging than just the simple purchase of a product. So the first reason why I think these programs are prevalent is I believe that many of the people working at the local council level look around them and they'll look at what's being done by other agencies that are working in the commercial field and believe that we can do the same thing when we're talking about sustainability related behavioral changes. The second point is politically expedient. Here in Canada, we ran a national ad campaign to encourage Canadians to make their homes more energy efficient and to change their transportation behaviors as a way to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. I wrote a brief for the federal government saying, don't do this. If you simply run an advertising campaign, there's a strong literature suggesting that that will have no impact upon Canadians' behavior with respect to energy efficiency and transportation. Canada squandered $27 million by running this campaign. The campaign was audited by Auditor General. There was no evidence that it changed energy efficiency behaviors or transportation actions, but it was politically expedient. And so that may be one of the reasons why these types of campaigns exist. The third, and this is not criticism of people at the local level, but many of them subscribe to ineffective models of behavioral change. Understandably, many of the people designed to deliver these programs don't have a background in marketing or a background in behavioral psychology, and as a result of that, they fall back upon their own implicit theories of how they would go about changing behavior. And the most prevalent one is, let's provide information. Let's try to change people's attitudes, change their knowledge with the hope that it will change behavior. Fourth, it's relatively easy to do. And then finally, fifth is, I think, perhaps the most interesting. The vast majority of environmental programs are not evaluated in a way that lets people know whether they've actually affected outcomes. People are usually evaluating outputs rather than outcomes. They're measuring the amount of exposure that people have had to the materials, number of people who have visited, for example, a Facebook page or Instagram account, rather than are they changing behavior, are they changing resource use, and are they changing resource quality? And if we had better measurement and evaluation of those initiatives, people would often think quite differently about how tax dollars are being spent in the programs that they're delivering. So all of that has led me for the last 3 decades and a bit to be talking about an alternative, something I call community-based social marketing. And I'm going to talk with you just briefly about what this process is, this framework is, and I'm going to walk you through this framework in the time that I've got. So community-based social marketing is a term that I coined about 32 years ago. I had just graduated, I was first beginning to teach, and I was reading extensively in the field of social marketing. I just have to think about where the field was some 30 plus years ago. And it was being applied almost extensively to, or exclusively, to health and safety related behavioral changes. And it was setting out this framework by which people could design, deliver more effective programs. But what was interesting 30 years ago is there was very little integration of knowledge coming from psychology into this framework in the field of social marketing. And so community-based social marketing is an attempt to merge together some of the best ideas from the behavioral sciences with knowledge in the field of marketing, particularly in the field of social marketing. And I decided to call it community-based social marketing, essentially to give a tip of a hat to some of the key findings from the field of psychology. So what are those? One of those is that the barriers to behavior change are almost always community specific. And if we don't know what those barriers are, the likelihood that we can get people to bicycle to work, for example, are going to be challenging for us to bring about. The second is that one of the most powerful levers for behavioral change is face-to-face communication. It continues to win out on virtually any other way in which we might communicate with individuals. And particularly related to this importance of face-to-face communication is the power of social diffusion, which has been studied extensively in psychology, and the power of social norms. And I'll just introduce one of those to you right now, and that's the power of social diffusion by telling you a quick anecdote. All of you, I presume, have seen iPod shuffles. I'm going to hold mine up to the camera right now. These are no longer made by Apple, but a decade ago they were very, very popular. Except that this is a very special iPod shuffle. It's actually waterproof. So why do I have a waterproof iPod shuffle and no one else for the most part has one of these? Because there's a company in Australia that bought thousands of iPod shuffles from Apple, took them apart, encased the electronics in plastic, put them back together so they're perfectly waterproof, and sold them along with waterproof headphones. Now, my youngest daughter, Jamie, and I used to swim together all the time. And I bought a set for my daughter and I brought a set for myself, and it just clips onto the back of your goggles and then short headphones that go into your ears. the time in which we started showing up at the pool with these, there was a number of other people that swam at the same time as us that would say, how is that possible? You could be swimming with an iPod shuffle. And I would say to them, as I just said to you, there's this company in Australia, etc. And they would say, oh, that's really remarkable. And then they would say to me, so how does it sound? And I would say to them, well, it's not as good as an above air, air-based headphone, but it's not bad. And then they would then say to me, so does it fall over your ears when you do a flip turn? And I'd have to say to them, honestly, have you ever seen me do a flip turn? But my daughter swam competitively, and Jamie was always never complaining of them falling out. And then people would then say, so how much does it cost and where can I get this from? And what started happening in our pool is all these other individuals started showing up with iPod shuffles that they bought online after they'd had this conversation with either myself, my daughter, or both of us. That's social diffusion. What's interesting about this is once a year they would close the pool that we used to swim at, and my daughter and I would have to go and swim someplace else, and there would be no one there actually swimming with an iPod shuffle. Social diffusion is often the number one determinant of people engaging in new behavior, and it's very much driven by conversations happening in the community. If we'll look at the installation, for example, of solar, 62 to 63% of the installation of solar people's rooftops is going through social diffusion. If we look at the installation of programmable thermostats, it's the number one driver of people installing programmable thermostats. And we see this again and again and again in terms of sustainability-related actions. So I call this community-based social marketing because it's merging together some of the best principles from the field of social marketing with knowledge coming out of psychology. As you can see on your screen, it's based upon 5 steps. The first step is very, very careful selection of which behaviors we're going to go after. In many, many cases, there's a plethora of different behaviors that community organizers might go after. So the first question we're asking is, which of those behaviors is most worthwhile to pursue? Once we decided which actions are most important, the second step is to do foundational research to identify the barriers and benefits to the behaviors that have been selected in the first step. The third step is to develop strategies. I want you to note here that it is plural rather than singular. One of the problems that I see many local agencies get into is that when they develop a strategy, they're just developing one strategy to try to foster behavioral change. And they can't know that that strategy is the most cost-effective program that they could be delivering unless they're testing it concurrently against other possibilities. So we want people to develop several different strategies to try to foster the behavioral change you're interested in, and at the same time measure return on investment when they pilot those strategies against each other. And then finally, whatever is the most cost-effective program, they want to move that on to broad-scale implementation. Now, none of what I'm showing you here is rocket science. Most of you are familiar with most of this from the framework of social marketing. What is different, though, is very careful selection of the behaviors, right? Doing barrier and benefit research that drill down at the level of a very specific action. So we can't say promote active commuting. We need to distinguish between people walking to work and people biking to work because those two different behaviors have very different barriers that go along with them. And then all the rest of this just flows logically from this. Now, while this may be for some of you your first introduction to community-based social marketing, or CBSM as many people call it, it's used broadly. There are now literally thousands of programs around the globe that are utilizing community-based social marketing as a basis for their initiatives. So for example, the US Department of Energy put out a report 5-ish years ago recommending that all residential energy efficiency programs in the United States be based upon community-based social marketing. So first step, selecting behaviors. When you think about selecting behaviors, one of the things I've been recommending for a long time now is that it's helpful to step back and ask, what sectors are most important for us to focus on? So let me show you an example from energy, but you can do the same thing if we were talking about waste, transport, conservation-related issues, whatever it is you're thinking about with respect to sustainability. So this is Canadian data. This is all forms of energy collapsed together and how they're utilized by different sectors. Turns out that industry is about 39% of all energy use. Transportation comes in at 30%. The residential sector comes in at 16%. Institutions and commerce come in at 13%, and agriculture comes in at 3%. Now, why it's really helpful to start off with a pie chart like this is you can step back and look at this and say, we could deliver great programs in the agricultural sector, but it just simply won't matter. It's too small of a slice of the overall pie for us to actually be effective. So we want to start with whatever sectors are using the most energy first. So that would be industry, and then transportation, and then the residential sector. But I'm going to, for pedagogical reasons, focus here on the residential sector because it's something that all of you have a lot of familiarity with. So let's pull out the residential sector in Canada. And this is how it breaks down. So space heating makes up 60% of all residential energy use. Now, why this is important to create a pie chart at the level of a particular sector is it allows us to quickly identify what behaviors might be most important. There's over 240 discrete actions that we can encourage people to be involved in that are related to residential energy use. 240 actions. It's a really, really long list. And what we're wanting to do is to try to find basically rubrics or heuristics that we can utilize to take that long list down to something that's much more manageable. So when you see a slice that dominates at the level of a particular sector, you know the most important behaviors have to be associated with that slice. Here's air conditioning. For those of you from the southern United States, it's 2% of residential energy use in Canada. Water heating comes in at 18%. Major appliances come in at 10%. Minor appliances are 5%. And then finally, lighting is 5%. Now, what's interesting about this pie chart is that in both the United States and in Canada, the behavioral area that we focused on most is lighting, which is the least important area to focus on. So we want to be able to step back and for a particular sector, create a pie chart like this that begins to help us to understand what areas might we focus on first that might be most important with respect to energy, water, waste, transport, etc. Once we've pulled out a slice within a particular sector, then we're asking an interesting question. What's a set of behaviors that we might possibly go after? And the guidance here basically is to try to create the universe of actions that are associated with that particular slice. So here's some of those. Getting people to install high efficiency shower heads, having people turn down the thermostat temperature on their hot water heater, having people install a blanket around their hot water heater, having people get rid of their hot water heater and replacing with an on-demand system, having people take shorter showers, washing clothes in cold water, using full dishwater loads. So that's not an exhaustive list, but it's demonstrating this idea that once we've found a particular slice that we believe is important, then we want to list the potential behavioral candidates. We don't know which of those behaviors yet are most important for us to go after, but we know that we have the second most important slice in this case, and we know that we've got a list of behaviors that we could possibly consider going after. Once you've got that list, we need to evaluate those behaviors against each other to try to determine which of them are most important. In my book, I talk about what I call Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 behaviors. And the simple idea here is we do not want to be going after Tier 2 or Tier 3 behaviors if there are Tier 1 actions that are very promising for us to still go after that we've not done a good job of getting people to actually engage in. So how would we work out what are those Tier 1 behaviors? And so I've been suggesting for a few years now, people use 4 characteristics in what I call a behavior selection matrix. So the first characteristic is the one that all of us would be thinking about. And that characteristic is simply impact. And what we're asking ourselves here is, what kinds of reductions in energy use do we get if people install a high efficiency shower head? Or if people install, for example, a wrap around their hot water heater? What's the reductions in energy use that goes along with each of those different behaviors? That's usually where people stop, though. And that's not helpful because we need to know not only how impactful the behavior is, but we need to know at the same time what's the actual probability or likelihood of people adopting the behaviors that are of high impact or moderate impact. And there's several different ways in which we can try to determine that. And I might answer questions you have about that later in the presentation. But we want to look at impact and we want to look at probability. And what we're looking for, obviously, is the highest impact behaviors that have a good probability of people actually adopting those actions. The third thing we want to consider is what are people presently doing? What are the adoption or penetration rates? So if most people have already installed high efficiency shower heads in your community, that's not a very useful behavior to go after. We're looking for a high impact, high probability, and presently low adoption or penetration rates. And then finally, we're looking at applicability. What percentage of businesses or households can actually engage in this particular behavior? Now, we can use these 4 characteristics to rigorously work out which behaviors are most worthwhile to go after. And here's an example of that from Australia. I served as a principal advisor on a large-scale program in Queensland that retrofitted some 400,000 to 500,000 households across the state to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. We took that long list of 240 behaviors and culled it down to a much shorter list of the most promising actions. And then we got information about probability and impact and penetration, which then allowed us to weight all of the behaviors and rank order them. And that became the foundation then of what they worked on. The same process is now being used in multiple other types of initiatives where people are working on biodiversity, conservation related issues, water, etc. And they're trying to work out, well, what is most worthwhile for us to pursue? Now, let's imagine that you have gone through this process, you've worked out which behaviors are most worthwhile to go after. Then both Jennifer and I would suggest to you that what you want to do then is ask yourself, do you have a simple, straightforward action, like getting people to turn computer equipment off or take a shorter shower? Or do you have a complex behavior in which people have to do multiple different things? This is something I've not yet written about. It's going to be in the 4th edition of my book that I'm working on now. This is a really useful concept. I call this a behavioral chain. Most complex behaviors look something like this. So this is an example of someone biking to work. These are the different things that we're actually wanting to look at. So the first is, do they have a bike? If they don't have a bike, they need to obtain a bike. And that breaks down to them either borrowing a bike, purchasing a bike, or renting a bike as part of a bike sharing initiatives. If they have a bike, then we're asking, well, is that bike in good working condition, or does it need to be repaired? And then there's a whole series of one-time actions that people need to engage in. They need to get the gear. They need to have the skill level to be able to bike to work. They need to have the level of fitness. They need to have a safe route that they can ride on. These are all one-time actions that people have to engage in before they can actually bike into work for the most part. And then we've got the repetitive action. And psychologists call this a behavioral script, where people often will engage in a series of behaviors in a particular sequence. People are often checking the weather. Often the night before they're going to bike into work. They're setting out the clothes that they will need based upon the weather. They might be making their lunch the night before for themselves or for children, perhaps. If they've got children, they're working out, can I do homework with them to give myself more time the morning of, if I do that homework with them the evening before, for example. Then they're actually biking to work. And what's interesting about this is what we call biking to work. But the ask is much larger than that. It encompasses all of these sub-actions that are associated with this behavioral chain. Once a person's gotten there, they need to secure their bike, and they probably may be showering then, and then changing, and then to their workplace. This is what we're really asking of people when they bike to work. Now, part of the reason why this is such a useful idea is that we can apply percentages in order to be able to segment the population. So in the United States, fully 2/3, 68% of people do not have a bike. So if we want those people to be biking to work, adults in the United States, we have to find ways to either help them to purchase a bike or borrow a bike that's part of a bike sharing initiative. Of the people who have a bike, that 32%, roughly half of them, their bike isn't working, and they would have to repair that bike before they actually bike into work. Now, why is it useful to apply these percentages? Well, we have a sense, obviously, of the size of these different segments, but each of these different segments have different barriers associated with them. Completely different barriers if you have to buy or rent a bike than if you already have a bike and you have to have the bike repaired. We can also determine whether some of the items in the behavioral chain are simply inconsequential to us. So fitness or skill level. 94% of adults in the United States report that they know how to ride a bike. We can essentially cross that off for the vast majority of individuals. They may not have the fitness, etc., but they know how to actually ride a bike. The second thing I found really helpful is we can begin to look at segments. So with the behavioral chain, the first segment is, are people intentional, right? Do they want to engage in this behavior? And I often say in my workshops that benefits trump barriers. If people are not intentional, you have to focus on motivation to get individuals to want to engage in this action before we try to strip away the barriers, the behavioral change that we're trying to encourage. The second segment is all these one-time behaviors that people have to engage in. And then finally, the last segment here is repetitive segment. The most people are going to engage in day in, day out is engage in this. Now, part of the reason why it's important to sort of look at these different segments is we can say to someone, you know what, we might be able to make this behavior easier by removing part of the complexity of this ask. So coming back to water efficient shower heads, I've worked on a program in New Zealand where rather than asking people to go to a hardware store to purchase a shower head, we brought the shower heads to the workplace instead. And we're removing all of the behavioral change segment that's associated with them traveling to the hardware store, picking up the shower head, paying for it, traveling back again. We're making the behavior much simpler by bringing the shower heads into the workplace and having them bring in old inefficient shower heads as a replacement and getting this new shower head instead. So sketching out behavioral chains like this can help us identify, are there parts or segments that we can simply get rid of? The other reason why this is a useful idea is that the behaviors that you see on the screen right now are where the barriers reside. So when you're thinking about doing foundational research, it's very easy or very helpful to sketch out what the ask is, and then ask ourselves when we're doing our foundational research in step 2 of CBSM, well, what are the barriers to people securing a bike? What are the barriers to someone being able to shower, for example? I'm trying to understand which of those barriers are things that we have to address in our programs. Once we've identified which behaviors are most important, we've done barrier and benefit research, once we've identified which behaviors are most important and we've worked out what a behavioral chain is, then we want to then move on to the second step of doing barrier and benefit research. And all of you are familiar, I'm sure, with doing foundational research, but that often means doing a literature search, doing observational work, doing focus groups, and doing survey research. I won't say more here other than to say that what Jennifer's found often most useful is to look at differences between people who are already involved in the behavior and those that are not. And whenever possible, to use multivariate statistics to try to be able to suss out what's the rank order of these barriers and benefits. People have limited funds, obviously, for delivering programs. It's really helpful for them to understand what are the most important barriers, what's a rank order for those actions, so they can design their programs based upon that knowledge. The third step then is developing strategies. And I want to just go over with you two different behavior change tools that have been studied extensively in psychology and showcase how they're being utilized in order to facilitate behavioral changes related to sustainability. So this is a project that I designed and helped to deliver in the city of Toronto. It's going after getting people to turn their vehicle engines off. So what we know in Canada is that at any given time in our warmer months, about 56% of Canadians idle their vehicles in different locations in which they might be parked. So think of a parent, for example, picking up a child at school. So we did extensive barrier and benefit research to this. Literature search, we did focus groups across the country. I wrote and conducted a national telephone survey and analyzed the data based upon using multivariate statistics to work out what barriers and benefits were most important for us to address and whether those barriers and benefits are relatively homogeneous across the country or whether they're somewhat heterogeneous. So what we learned when we did that barrier and benefit research is that, first of all, while this was a program funded to reduce carbon dioxide emissions in Canada by getting people to stop idling their cars, reducing CO2 showed up nowhere on the list of reasons why people would actually engage in this action. The most important benefit instead was improving local air quality. And I'll describe to you in a moment how we made use of that. On the barrier side, we included some 25 to 26 different potential barriers, but there were 3 that turned out to be particularly important that we needed to address. The first is people were simply forgetting. So someone's waiting outside of their child's school and they're pulling out their smartphone, they're checking messages, etc., and they're not thinking about turning their engine off immediately. Secondly, Canadians tend to believe they should idle their car for longer than 3 minutes before it's fuel efficient to turn the car off and restart it. Transport Canada's done this research. We should all be turning our cars off immediately, but that's not what Canadians believe. And then finally, Canadians tend to believe that turning their engines on and off repeatedly will hurt their starter. That was true when I learned to drive 40 some years ago. It's not true today. Ford, other major manufacturers have done this research. It's a non-issue, but that's not what Canadians believe. And what's important about that is we need to deal with perceived barriers as if they are real barriers when we're designing and delivering programs. So we've done the barrier and benefit research, and then we're going to develop a strategy specifically to target those barriers and benefits. And as I said to you before, we're going to test that strategy or test those strategies against each other to find which is most cost effective. So we're going to deliver the strategy at some schools and also what are called TTC, Toronto Transit Commission, kiss and ride sites. So in some of those locations, schools and TTC kiss and ride sites, we're going to use just signs. And that's what you see on the left-hand side of your screen. Those signs are large. They're large metal signs that we had printed and made up. We put them on sawed-off signposts. Now, why are we doing that? Because the psychological literature around prompts clearly suggests a prompt has to be in someone's visual or auditory field in order to influence their behavior. So we've dropped the height of the signs to make sure that people can actually see them. And what I can tell you conclusively is the signs by themselves in Canada do not work to change people's behavior. Now, in contrast, in the other strategy, we're going to still use the signs, but we're going to do something much more than just use those signs. So let's imagine, Alicia, that you have a daughter, and I'm working on this particular program, and you happen to be outside of your daughter's school, and I motion to you. I've got a t-shirt on that says I'm working on this program. I've got a neon vest. I've got photo identification, so I look officious, and I motion to Alicia that I'd like to speak with her. And she rolls down her window. And when she rolls down her window, I literally point at my t-shirt, and I say to her, as you can see, I'm delivering a program to improve air quality for children at the school. So I'm starting Alicia with that because I want to make sure that you're intentional, that you're thinking this might be something you want to hear more about because of the way in which this is being presented. So I start off by referencing that I'm working with the Toronto Department of Health, and we're delivering a program to improve the health for children at the school. I then say to her that I didn't know this until recently, but most Canadians believe they shall idle their car for longer than 3 minutes before it's fuel efficient to turn the car off and restart it. And I say to you, Transport Canada's done this research. They're demonstrating that people should be turning their cars off immediately. And furthermore, turning your car on and off repeatedly won't hurt your starter. That was true years ago. It's not true today. So notice that literally in the space of 3 sentences, I've addressed the most important benefit, and I've addressed 2 of the 3 barriers. I then say to Alicia, would you be willing, both at your child's school and other locations across the province of Ontario, to turn your vehicle engine off? 82% of the people that we spoke with on the spot said, yes, I'd be willing to do that. But if you're taking notes, what you might jot down is, that is the weakest type of commitment that you can actually seek. It's a verbal private commitment between 2 individuals. Up from a verbal private commitment is I ask Alicia to sign something, committing herself to turn her engine off. Up from that, even more so, is I say to Alicia, could I publish your name along with the names of other parents in the local school newsletter? It turns out, interestingly, you don't want to do any of those 3 things. I've just walked you through a couple of decades of research in the field of social psychology and people's evolving knowledge around how to utilize commitments well. What you want to do instead is you want to make use of what I call a public and durable commitment. And that's what you see on the right-hand side of the screen. That sticker in real life is about this large. It costs us 2.5 cents per vehicle to actually produce, and it has 4 different behavior change tools built into it. The first is that it's a prompt. So I say to Alicia, we know that most Canadians forget to turn their engines off. And so I would encourage you to put this sticker on the front windshield of your vehicle in order to remind you to turn your engine off. And just have to leave it there long enough that it actually gets you in the habit of turning your engine off. But you'll notice something atypical about it. The sticker's actually outward facing. So what you're seeing on the screen is what people would see if they're outside of Alicia's car looking at the front window. So why have we done that? Because if a behavior is essentially invisible, as turning an engine off is in the community, you need to badge that behavior. And so by having it be outward facing, we're facilitating social norms where other parents at Alicia's daughter's school will think they should be turning their engines off. And even if people are not thinking that, they may be talking to one another and beginning to encourage others to be turning their engines off. So we have both social diffusion, social norms, the prompt, and this is also public and durable commitment. Now we've made the back of the sticker purposely transparent. So even though it's going to be inverted for Alicia, you can still be reminded to be turning your engine off. So 82% make a verbal private commitment, 32% put the sticker on while we're there, some other percentage would have done it after we've left. Right? So let me share the results of this. This is a huge project. We were running at a whole series of different parking lots, both schools as well as the TTC kiss and ride sites. And we have over 8,000 observations of people coming and going into these different parking lots. And we're measuring 2 things. Are people idling in their car, yes or no? And if they are idling, what's the length of time that they're idling for? And we're measuring those using a whole series of different stopwatches. We get a 32% reduction in the number of vehicles idling. And we know that this is our program because we also had control locations where we don't get this change. But look what happens with duration. We nearly wipe out idling in these locations. We get a 73% reduction in the length of time that people are idling their cars for. So this program was initially delivered in Toronto as a pilot test. It was then delivered in Mississauga for the whole city. They did the municipal fleet, most but not all the schools, most of the major parking lots. I did the city of Sudbury, where we did all 49 schools, the whole municipal fleet, all the major parking lots. We saw very similar results when we went from a pilot to broad-scale implementation. Natural Resources Canada then created this as a toolkit that could be utilized by literally municipalities all across the country and around the world. We now have some 200 Canadian municipalities making use of the initial work that we did in Toronto and some 8 countries around the world using this toolkit. And to this day, you can go onto Natural Resources Canada Anti-Idling website and learn more about this particular project and download all the materials delivered program locally based upon this. The second behavior change tool I want to discuss with you is social norms. And I want to introduce you to just 2 examples related to this. The first is a project that never ever should have got through ethics at any university in the world. This is the work of a man named Elliot Aronson. He used to teach at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And he's in the men's athletic shower room. And he looks around and he sees that there's this new sign that says, California is in drought conditions. Please turn your water off while you soap yourself up, and then turn the water on to rinse yourself off. And Aronson looks around, and none of the other men in the athletic shower room, this common area, are actually doing this. So he's a social psychologist, and he thinks to himself, I wonder if I could make use of social norms to increase the likelihood that people would actually engage in this behavior. So I want you to think about the ethics of this. If you're running this as an actual experiment, you'd have to measure and record whether people are changing their behavior. These are nude people. The only way you could do this is you're either going to have to videotape nude people showering, or you're going to have to watch nude people showering and record their behavior. Again, this would get through ethics at virtually no place, but this is California, and somehow he gets acceptance for this. On top of that, imagine what it would look like if you're the Confederate. If you're the Confederate in this particular study, your job is to stand in the shower and shower and shower and shower, waiting for someone to show up. When the person shows up, you're not allowed to look at that person. You're not allowed to say anything to that individual. You just soap yourself up with the shower turned off, turn the shower back on to rinse yourself off, and leave. And again, in social psychology, that's called the descriptive social norm. And that's how most norms actually begin, is we see what other people around us are actually doing. So he has 3 circumstances here. Just the sign by itself, or the sign plus 1 Confederate, or the sign plus 2 Confederates. Look at the power of social norms around this behavior. When it's just a sign by itself, only 6% of the men are actually turning the water off. But when it's the sign plus 1 Confederate, and remember, these Confederates are not allowed to look at the other people, they're not allowed to say anything, we go from 6% to 49%. And when we have 2 people who are acting as Confederates, it goes all the way up to 2/3 of the people are now turning the water off. It's an interesting example of making use of social norms as a way to try to facilitate changes in people's behavior. So let me show you how we've worked with this with the City of Houston, Houston Zoo. This is a program that was cut short somewhat by the pandemic, but it's a really interesting example pedagogically of thinking about using social norms. So this is a project in which we're focusing on trying to reduce entanglement of sea turtles and reducing entanglement of nesting shoreline birds. And I won't get into the background research related to why we focused on this, but we realized, based upon research done by the EPA and by NOAA in the United States, the principal forms of entanglement are not from commercial fishing, nor are they from offshore recreational fishing. They tend to be, not exclusively, but primarily from people who are fishing onshore and are leaving behind fishing line that's been snagged, and they're leaving it basically on the shoreline, and it's entangling both sea turtles as well as nesting shoreline birds. So that's a background to this. What we wanted to do was to deliver a program in which we're encouraging people through the use of social norms to change their behavior. And so let me show you some of the program materials here. So this is a pier in Houston, Texas. And as people walk out to this pier to fish, we set up a kiosk display. This was the work of Martha Park and a number of her co-workers at the Houston Zoo. And as people came up on this particular day, we're doing what I call a pilot to a pilot. This is an exceptionally useful idea. We knew the basic portions of what we wanted to build into this program, but what we did not know and could not know is would people allow us to actually take photographs of themselves. So these are people who are fishing along this pier, and we want to take a photograph of them committing themselves to actually recycling their fishing line. So the reason why she's going like this is on this particular morning, they approached 21 different people who were about to fish on that pier and said to them, we're delivering a program to reduce entanglement of sea turtles and nesting shoreline birds, and we're asking people if they would commit themselves to recycling their fishing line. Would you allow me to take a photograph of you and put it up in this kiosk display? Now, what we're actually doing here is we're making use of photographs, which are public and durable commitments, but we're grouping them together in close proximity to the behavior. And when you do that, you're almost instantly creating descriptive social norms. Now, the reason why she has her finger up like this is that's what we most want to do, is take photographs of these individuals, but we did not know whether people would be willing to allow us to actually do this. Approached 21 people, 19 of them said sure. The 3 people who said, no, not yet. Please wait until I've caught a fish and then take a photograph of me, because I noticed that none of these other people actually have photographs of themselves with a fish, and you know the competition that exists between people who fish. So this is the very first day of doing this. Here's this thing filled in with all these different photographs. We are purposely making the kiosk display small, so this montage of photographs gives the clear impression that most people who fish here think that this is a behavior that people ought to be involved in. Right? Very simple types of measurements. We also have, by the way, containers that people can put their recycled fishing line in to recycle. And we also gave them stickers that were self-adhesive that they could put onto their lure box as an ongoing reminder of the prompt and a commitment that would also hopefully foster some social diffusion around these actions. So very simple measurements. We're measuring the amount of fishing line before we deliver the program as a pretest, and then we're measuring the amount of fishing line that's there after we put this program in place. And we dramatically increase the amount that's being recycled, going from 18% to 50%. Now, this again was cut short by the pandemic, but in many cases like this, social norms over time increase people's engagement and behavior, especially if the behavior like this is visible, where people can see that other people are engaged in these actions. So I want to finish up by giving you a set of recommendations, then I'll ask for questions and comments you might have that you've not already asked of Jennifer in the chat. So in terms of recommendations, the first is this. It's really critically important that we tier behaviors. What I've seen increasingly over my career is that people are delivering programs with obviously the right intention, but often for the wrong behaviors. And we need to provide rigorous guidance of what that might look like. In my mind, at least, it's a good point for us to start to be thinking about impact, probability, penetration, and applicability as a way to be able to suss out which behaviors are most worthwhile to pursue. And what we want to suggest is that agencies should be doing that before they decide what they will fund. Let's work out which behaviors are most worthwhile first. Secondly, we want to identify the barriers and benefits to those particular actions. I'm doing a workshop next week for the New Zealand Ministry for the Environment. And one of the things I've been suggesting to, or will be suggesting to their executives, is they literally stop thinking about just funding people to deliver programs, but instead they provide stage funding. So in the first stage, you fund people to do the behavioral selection and do the barrier and benefit research, because it makes little sense for us to fund people to deliver programs when we don't know yet which behaviors are most important to go after. So phase 1 would be fund people to do the behavioral selection, fund people to do the foundational research, and then and only then fund people to develop strategies and pilot test them. Think of that as being phase 2. And then we only provide people with funding for broad-scale implementation once we know that we have cost-effective programs that bring about these behavioral changes. If we saw state, provincial, local agencies begin to adopt this, it would dramatically change the quality programs that are delivered by encouraging people to ensure that they were focusing on the right behaviors, they had good core knowledge around what the barriers to those actions were and what would motivate people, and they're testing different strategies against each other. So we want to pilot test those strategies. We want to pilot test, like we did in the anti-idling program in several different jurisdictions. And if we see that we've got a robust strategy that works well in different jurisdictions, then let's start thinking about creating turnkey toolkits that people can utilize in order to be able to deliver the programs without having to necessarily go through all the previous steps that I just described to you. So let me stop there. I'm going to just put up on the screen here resources for those of you who want to read further. Remi's already mentioned on my website, which is cbsm.com. But just let me mention two of the books that I've either written myself or co-authored. Fostering Sustainable Behavior, it's in 3rd edition. 4th edition is going to come out hopefully early next year. Social Marketing to Protect the Environment, which is a whole series of case studies of people applying social marketing knowledge and behavioral science knowledge to sustainability-related initiatives. I also have a weekly newsletter that's free, and I'm going to just type into chat right now the sign up page for that. There's about 20,000 people that subscribe to this, and on a weekly basis, they're just short missives that describe the use of behavioral science knowledge as it applies to health, safety, and environment-related behaviors.